There's a kind of currency more precious than gold, more powerful than armies, and more enduring than empires' knowledge. In the shadows of medieval castles and monasteries, far from the battles and crowns we often associate with this era, a quiet revolution was taking place. The scribes, armed not with swords but with quills and parchment, were weaving a hidden network of ideas that would shape the course of history. Picture this: a lone traveler, cloaked and cautious, carrying scrolls stuffed with secrets, mathematical breakthroughs, medical discoveries, philosophical treatises passed hand to hand across borders, often at great personal risk. This wasn't just about copying texts. It was a high-stakes trade where wisdom was the ultimate commodity, and scribes were its most daring merchants. What drove these individuals to dedicate their lives to such a perilous craft? It wasn't fame or fortune. Many of their names are lost to time. Instead, it was something deeper, a belief that knowledge belonged to humanity, not to any one kingdom or ruler. In an age where literacy was rare and books were handmade treasures, scribes became the guardians of progress. They worked in dimly lit scriptoriums, painstakingly translating and preserving works from ancient Greece, Rome, and the Islamic world, ensuring that ideas didn't vanish with the fall of empires. But their role didn't end there. These scribes were also master negotiators, bartering texts like traders in a bustling marketplace, building bridges between cultures that otherwise saw each other as enemies. Today, we take for granted that knowledge flows freely: libraries, universities, the internet. But none of that would exist without the clandestine efforts of these medieval knowledge brokers. Their story is one of quiet heroism, of risks taken in the name of progress, and of a network so effective it laid the groundwork for the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and even our modern world. As we unravel their methods, the coded messages, the hidden routes, the alliances forged in ink, you'll begin to see how these scribes didn't just copy history, they made it. And by the end, you'll never look at a book the same way again. So let's step into their world, where every stroke of the pen was an act of defiance, and every scroll carried the potential to change everything. To understand just how vital scribes were in medieval society, we have to step inside their world, a place where ink was as valuable as blood, and every word copied by hand had the weight of history behind it. These weren't just men hunched over desks. They were scholars, translators, and sometimes even spies, moving knowledge across hostile borders under the guise of simple clerical work. In monasteries, they labored by candlelight, painstakingly reproducing Bibles, philosophical works, and scientific treatises, often adding their own marginal notes, tiny whispers of insight that connected the past to the present. At royal courts, scribes drafted laws, treaties, and correspondence, wielding influence far beyond their humble titles. And in the fledgling universities of Europe, they copied textbooks for students hungry to learn medicine, astronomy, or law, fueling the intellectual fires that would eventually blaze into the Renaissance. But here's what's truly remarkable. Scribes didn't just preserve knowledge, they curated it. Imagine a monk in a cold stone scriptorium, faced with a crumbling Greek manuscript. He couldn't simply photocopy it. He had to interpret faded ink, decipher unfamiliar handwriting, and sometimes even translate languages that hadn't been spoken for centuries. Every decision he made, what to keep, what to omit, how to phrase a tricky passage, shaped how future generations would understand the ancient world. A single mistranslated word could alter the course of science or theology for decades. That's why the best scribes weren't just skilled with a pen. They were thinkers, theologians, and scientists in their own right, and their influence stretched beyond Europe. In the Islamic world, scribes in bustling cities like Baghdad and Cordoba worked alongside scholars, translating Greek and Roman texts into Arabic, then refining them with new discoveries in mathematics, medicine, and optics. These works would later travel back to Europe, often through the hands of Jewish scribes who bridged the divide between cultures. It was a vast, invisible relay race of ideas, with scribes as the runners passing the baton across continents and centuries. Yet their work was fraught with danger. In an era where heresy could mean execution, copying the wrong book, say, a text challenging church doctrine or a prince's authority, could be a death sentence. Some scribes worked in secret, smuggling forbidden knowledge like contraband. Others encoded messages in the margins or disguised controversial texts as harmless works. They were the original whistleblowers, risking everything to ensure that truth, no matter how inconvenient, survived. So when we flip through a modern book or scroll through a digital library, we're standing on the shoulders of these unsung heroes. Every page they saved, every idea they smuggled, was a stitch in the tapestry of human progress. And while their names may be forgotten, their legacy is written in the very foundations of our world. Monasteries were more than just places of prayer. They were the beating heart of medieval knowledge, where scribes transformed quiet scriptoria into the first true libraries of Europe. Imagine a room thick with the scent of ink and candle wax, where rows of monks bent over wooden desks, their quills scratching against parchment in near silence. This was no simple copying factory. Every manuscript they produced was a labor of devotion, often taking months or even years to complete. But what made these scriptoria revolutionary wasn't just the painstaking work, it was their role as crossroads for ideas. Monks didn't merely replicate texts, they built networks stretching across kingdoms. A manuscript copied in a French monastery might travel to Germany, then to England, carried by visiting scholars or traded like sacred currency. Even during wars or plagues, these connections endured. Monasteries functioned like early data centers, sharing knowledge through a kind of medieval internet, one powered by parchment and patience. The Benedictine order alone established hundreds of scriptoria, each linked to the others through a web of correspondence and travel. The books they saved tell the story. When a monk in Spain copied a crumbling Roman text on architecture, or an Irish scribe preserved Greek philosophy ignored elsewhere, they weren't just saving words, they were rescuing entire disciplines from oblivion. Take the famous Lindisfarne Gospels, crafted in a remote English monastery. Its intricate designs blended Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Mediterranean influences, proving that even in isolated places, scribes were stitching together a shared European intellectual identity. But scriptoria had their own hierarchies and secrets. Senior monks often assigned the most important texts to trusted scribes, while beginners practiced on less critical works. Marginal notes, sometimes complaints about cold fingers or bad ink, reveal their humanity. Occasionally, a scribe would sneak personal commentary into a text, like the monk who doodled a tiny cat chasing birds in the margin of a psalm. These touches remind us that behind every pristine page were real people fighting fatigue to keep wisdom alive. The system wasn't perfect. Some texts were altered to fit church doctrine, or lost because no one prioritized them. Yet without these monastic hubs, works by Aristotle, Hippocrates, and countless others might have vanished forever. When Charlemagne kickstarted his educational reforms in the 8th century, he turned to monasteries as his backbone, recognizing their unmatched power to spread learning. So next time you see a medieval manuscript in a museum, look closer. Those ink strokes are more than writing, they're the fingerprints of a revolution. The same caravan routes that carried silk from China and spices from India also bore a far more subtle cargo: scrolls filled with knowledge tucked between bolts of fabric and sacks of pepper. While merchants haggled over the price of goods in bustling marketplaces from Baghdad to Byzantium, scribes conducted their own transactions in the shadows, bartering not in gold but in ideas. A Persian medical text might find its way to a Syrian monastery, where a monk would translate it into Greek before it traveled onward to Italy, morphing with each new copy to suit the needs of its latest audience. These weren't just books changing hands, they were living things reshaped by every scribe who touched them. Take the journey of a single manuscript, say, a treatise on astronomy written in 9th century Baghdad. A merchant might carry it to Damascus, where a Christian scribe would add notes in the margins, reconciling its star charts with biblical teachings. From there, it could cross into Byzantine lands, where a scholar would translate it into a new language, smoothing out passages that clashed with local beliefs. By the time it reached a university in Paris or Bologna, the original text had layers of commentary, corrections, and even contradictions, each layer a snapshot of the cultures it passed through. This was knowledge as a conversation, not a monologue. But scribes didn't just translate words, they translated worlds. A mathematical concept from India, like the numeral 0, had to be stripped of its Hindu origins before European monks would accept it. Medical texts from the Islamic world, filled with references to Prophet Muhammad's teachings, were carefully sanitized for Christian audiences. Sometimes the changes were practical. A recipe for ink in a Persian manual might call for ingredients unavailable in Spain, so a scribe would improvise with local substitutes. Other times, the edits were political. A chronicle praising a Muslim ruler could be rewritten to glorify a Christian king instead, with the original author's name quietly erased. The most successful scribes were cultural chameleons, fluent not just in languages but in the unspoken rules of their audiences. A Jewish scholar in Toledo might work by day translating Arabic texts into Latin for a Christian patron, then by night copy Hebrew commentaries for his own community, a delicate balancing act of faith and scholarship. In Constantinople, a scribe could produce lavish gospel books for the emperor's court, while secretly preserving pagan philosophy condemned by the church. Their work required a diplomat's tact, a forger's skill, and sometimes a spy's discretion. And just like the silk trade, this exchange of ideas had its black markets. Forbidden texts, those challenging religious dogma or royal authority, circulated in whispers, passed from trusted hand to hand. A scribe in Cairo might copy a controversial work on anatomy, hiding it inside a bundle of innocuous poetry. In Europe, heretical manuscripts were sometimes written in code, their true meaning legible only to initiates. The stakes were high. Possession of the wrong book could mean exile or execution. Yet scribes kept taking the risk, driven by the belief that knowledge, no matter how dangerous, deserved to survive. What emerged from this hidden economy was something extraordinary, a shared intellectual heritage that transcended borders. The same stars studied in Baghdad were mapped in Oxford. The same laws debated in Cordoba were cited in Paris. While kings waged wars over territory, scribes were quietly building a republic of letters, one manuscript at a time. Behind every great scribe stood a patron, a king with a thirst for legitimacy, a bishop eager to control doctrine, or a merchant prince looking to burnish his legacy. Sponsoring scribes wasn't charity, it was a calculated move in the medieval game of power. Consider Charlemagne, who didn't just conquer lands, he conquered minds. By bankrolling scriptoria across his empire, he ensured that every copied manuscript carried his vision of a unified Christian Europe. His scribes didn't just preserve texts, they crafted a cultural blueprint for imperial rule, subtly weaving his triumphs into chronicles and law codes. For rulers, a well-stocked library was as vital as a well-trained army. Both were tools to shape the world. Religious institutions played an even subtler game. Monasteries might seem like humble retreats, but their scriptoria were ideological factories. A bishop commissioning a lavish Bible wasn't just funding art, he was reinforcing church authority. Gold leaf illuminations of saints and judgment scenes weren't mere decorations. They were visual propaganda, teaching illiterate masses through imagery what words alone couldn't convey. And when rival factions clashed over theology, scribes became frontline soldiers. A carefully altered passage in a copied creed, a lost manuscript that contradicted official doctrine, these were the quiet battles that decided orthodoxy. But patronage had its pitfalls. A scribe dependent on a noble's goodwill might soften criticism of his patron's wars or exaggerate his piety. Historical chronicles from this period often read like linked-in endorsements, filled with flattering accounts of battles won and taxes lowered. Yet some scribes pushed back. Hidden between the lines of a glowing biography, you might find a cryptic joke or an oddly detailed account of a patron's defeat, tiny acts of rebellion preserved in parchment. The most fascinating patrons, though, were the outliers like the Islamic caliph Al-Ma'mun, who paid scribes their weight in gold to translate Greek philosophy into Arabic, not for piety or politics but pure curiosity. Or Elena of Aquitaine, who commissioned troubadour poetry and legal texts alike, using knowledge to craft her legacy as Europe's most formidable queen. Their support proves that while money shaped manuscripts, the hunger for understanding sometimes transcended power plays. In the end, every sponsored manuscript was a negotiation between scribe and patron, truth and expediency, preservation and control. The ink might fade, but the fingerprints of influence remain. A single manuscript wasn't just a collection of words, it was a small fortune crafted from sweat and scarcity. Take the vellum, for instance. This wasn't ordinary paper but the stretched and scraped skin of calves, often requiring dozens of animals for a single book. The finest pages came from unborn or newborn calves, their skins thin and smooth as silk, making a Bible's worth of parchment costlier than a peasant's yearly earnings. And that was just the canvas. The ink, ground from gallnuts and mixed with iron salts, had to be brewed to the perfect consistency. Too thick, and it clogged the quill; too thin, and it bled through the precious vellum. Scribes even had secret recipes, some adding wine or honey to prevent fading, turning each page into a chemical experiment that had to survive centuries. Then came the labor. A scribe might spend 12 hours a day for months on a single text, his hand cramping under the weight of perfection. One slip of the quill and an entire page could be ruined, forcing him to scrape away the ink with a knife and start over, if the vellum wasn't torn beyond repair. The Benedictine rule, followed by many monastic scribes, explicitly limited copying to 6 hours a day to prevent exhaustion, but deadlines for royal commissions or liturgical books often pushed them harder. Payment varied wildly. A skilled scribe in a Paris workshop might earn enough to live comfortably, while a monastery's copyist worked for little more than bread and prayer. Yet even the humblest scribe knew his labor was worth more than gold, literally. In the 12th century, a finely illuminated gospel book could fetch a price equal to a small estate, making manuscripts not just tools of learning but stores of wealth, traded as collateral for loans or offered as diplomatic gifts between kings. The economics of this trade reveal a stark truth. Knowledge was a luxury. A university student in medieval Bologna might rent a textbook by the page, memorizing passages quickly because owning a whole volume was unthinkable. Libraries chained their books to desks, not just to prevent theft but to protect investments worth more than the furniture that held them. Even the wealthy sometimes balked at the cost. Queen Isabella of Spain famously grumbled about the outrageous price of a single illuminated chronicle, though she paid it anyway. Yet for all the expense, scribes found ways to adapt. Margins became testing grounds for cheaper inks, scraps of reused parchment turned into notebooks, and older texts were scrubbed clean to make room for new ones, a practice called palimpsesting that left ghostly traces of erased wisdom beneath fresh words. Some scribes even became early conservationists, carefully repairing aging manuscripts with threads and glues, knowing that each saved page was a victory against time itself. When you hold a modern paperback, remember, what costs us pennies once demanded fortunes. The scribes who balanced these brutal economics didn't just make books, they made miracles. Some books were never meant to be found, tucked beneath monastery floorboards, concealed in false-bottomed chests, or buried in clay jars. Forbidden knowledge survived through the cunning of scribes who understood the peril and power of ideas. While official libraries displayed approved texts, shadow collections thrived in the margins, preserving works that challenged kings, popes, and emperors. Imagine a Benedictine monk in the 10th century, his hands trembling not from cold but from fear as he copied a pagan philosophy text onto a scrap of parchment small enough to hide in his sleeve. Or a Jewish physician in Muslim Spain, secretly translating a banned medical treatise by candlelight, knowing its insights into human anatomy could cost him his life. These weren't just readers, they were outlaws, trading in the most dangerous commodity of all, truth. The geography of these hidden libraries reads like a spy's map. In the caves of Mount Athos, Greek monks safeguarded ancient Neoplatonic works condemned by the Church. Beneath the Umayyad palaces of Cordoba, scrolls debating the eternity of the world were stored in locked chests, accessible only to trusted scholars. Even the Vatican, that bastion of orthodoxy, had its shadow archives, rooms where controversial texts were kept for study, but never circulated. The most ingenious hiding places were invisible in plain sight. A psalter with innocent-looking illuminations might contain coded alchemical formulas in its border designs. A chronicle of saints' lives could have heretical arguments subtly woven into its footnotes, legible only to those who knew where to look. Smuggling these texts required equal parts bravery and artistry. Scribes became masters of disguise, stitching pages into the linings of merchants' coats or hollowing out loaves of bread to conceal slim volumes. Some used a technique called book breaking, dismantling a dangerous text and rebinding its pages into less suspicious works. A treatise on astronomy might be hidden inside a farming manual, its true contents revealed only to those who knew the correct order to reassemble the leaves. Others relied on the medieval equivalent of encryption, writing in obscure dialects or crafting acrostic poems where the first letters of each line spelled out forbidden ideas. The risks were unimaginable. In 1264, the Bishop of Paris ordered the burning of cartloads of Jewish texts seized from private libraries, erasing centuries of medical and philosophical scholarship. During the Spanish Inquisition, homes were raided for hidden Qurans or Talmudic commentaries, their owners tortured for leads on other clandestine collections. Yet scribes kept whispering. When the Church banned the works of philosopher Averroes for claiming the world was eternal, Italian scholars smuggled them from Toledo to Padua, where they quietly shaped the foundations of Renaissance thought. Every burned book seemed to spawn 10 more copies, each one a quiet act of defiance. What's astonishing isn't just that these texts survived, it's how they shaped history from the shadows. The recovery of Lucretius on the nature of things, A Roman Epicurean poem hidden for centuries in a German monastery would later ignite debates that sparked the scientific revolution. Arabic medical texts preserved in secret by Jewish scribes during pogroms became the bedrock of European medicine. These weren't just acts of preservation, they were silent revolutions, proving that ideas refused to die simply because power demanded it. The scribes who guarded these words understood something we often forget. Knowledge isn't just about what's written, it's about who gets to decide what's remembered. In an age where information feels endlessly accessible, their struggle reminds us that every library, every archive, every book is a battleground, and sometimes the most important stories are the ones someone tried desperately to erase. The scribe's quill wasn't just a copying tool, it was a bridge between worlds. When a Greek philosophical text arrived in Baghdad or an Arabic medical treatise reached Spain, the words didn't simply leap onto the page in a new language. Translators faced a puzzle far more complex than swapping one word for another. They had to navigate minefields of cultural context, religious bias, and even gaps in vocabulary. Imagine a 9th century scholar in Toledo staring at an Arabic description of the human heart, realizing his Latin had no equivalent term for ventricle. Do you invent a new word, borrow from Greek, or reshape the entire explanation to fit the concepts your audience already understood? Every choice rippled through history. Take the case of Constantine the African, an 11th century monk who smuggled medical texts from North Africa to Italy. His translations didn't just convey information, they performed cultural alchemy. Arabic references to Muhammad became biblical allusions. Descriptions of wine-based remedies were tweaked to avoid offending Christian teetotalers. Yet the core science remained intact, allowing European doctors to absorb Islamic medical advances without triggering heresy accusations. This wasn't censorship, it was survival. A literal translation might have gotten the text burned. A creative one let Hippocratic principles live on in a hostile environment. The most skilled translators worked like diplomats, balancing fidelity to the original with sensitivity to their audience. Jewish scribes in medieval Spain became masters of this dance. Fluent in Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin, they could take a Persian astronomy text, strip it of references to Zoroastrian astrology, and reframe its star charts to align with both Torah and church teachings. Their translations didn't just cross language barriers, they built neutral meeting grounds where scholars from clashing faiths could share discoveries without abandoning their identities. Sometimes the adaptations were shockingly bold. When Gerard of Cremona translated the works of the Persian philosopher Avicenna into Latin, he didn't just change words, he restructured entire arguments to resonate with European scholasticism. Passages about the first cause were amplified to echo Christian theology, while sections on logic were trimmed to avoid overwhelming readers. The result: a text that felt familiar enough to be accepted, yet revolutionary enough to reshape Western thought. But not all translations were so careful. Some scribes, pressured by patrons or pressed for time, introduced errors that distorted knowledge for generations. A mistranslated passage in a Greek geometry text might turn a precise theorem into nonsense. A rushed rendering of an Arabic chemistry manual could swap heat gently for boil vigorously, ruining experiments across continents. The worst cases weren't accidents, but weapons hostile translations deliberately warped to discredit rival schools of thought. A Byzantine scribe might render an Islamic scholar's nuanced argument as crude blasphemy, ensuring its rejection before it was even read. Yet for every distortion, there were triumphs of clarity. The collaborative translation projects in Moorish Spain, where teams of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked side by side, produced staggeringly accurate texts. Their method was revolutionary, first a literal translation, then a roundtable debate to refine phrasing, and finally a polish by poets to preserve the original's elegance. This wasn't just translation, it was intellectual diplomacy, proving that knowledge could transcend the wars and prejudices of its carriers. What's often overlooked is how these translated texts evolved beyond their origins. A Sanskrit mathematical concept filtered through Arabic and Latin might emerge in Renaissance Europe with entirely new applications. The journey didn't just preserve ideas, it transformed them like a river carving new paths through stone. When we read a modern textbook quoting Aristotle or Avicenna, we're not seeing their pure words but layers of interpretation, each scribe's choices shaping what survived. The real legacy of these translators isn't just in the texts they saved, but in the radical idea they proved, that wisdom has no native language. In an age of walls and wars, they showed that human understanding could flow freely if someone was brave enough to build the bridges. Beneath the veneer of sanctioned scholarship thrived a bustling black market, one where manuscripts changed hands in alleyways, smuggled in wine barrels or sewn into the linings of pilgrims' robes. This wasn't just trade, it was treason against ignorance, conducted by scribes who doubled as smugglers and collectors who risked ruin for a single page of forbidden wisdom. In Venice, a merchant might discreetly slip an Arabic medical text to a buyer in a backroom, while in Paris, a university student could barter a year's tuition for a contraband copy of Aristotle's lost works. The demand wasn't driven by greed, but by desperation for knowledge so dangerous it had been erased from official records, yet so vital that men would gamble their lives to possess it. The logistics of this underground trade were as ingenious as they were perilous. A scribe in Cairo might disassemble a controversial treatise on astronomy, scattering its pages among harmless prayer books to evade customs inspectors. In Constantinople, dealers used a network of ship captains and relic sellers to move texts disguised as religious artifacts, knowing no god would dare desecrate a crate marked holy relics. Some manuscripts were even written in disappearing ink, legible only when heated or treated with chemicals, allowing them to pass as blank parchment if seized. The most brazen operatives played a double game, like the monk who worked as an official censor by day while running a clandestine scriptorium by night, producing flawless forgeries of banned texts with subtly altered conclusions to slip past authorities. What fueled this underground economy? Sometimes it was pure scholarship. When the church banned the works of the philosopher Averroes for challenging the immortality of the soul, medical students in Montpellier secretly traded fragments of his commentaries, knowing his insights into anatomy could save lives. Other times it was political. A nobleman might pay a fortune for a suppressed chronicle proving his rival's illegitimate lineage, or a rebel group could circulate heretical translations of the Bible to undermine clerical authority. The rarest commodities weren't always the oldest. Contemporary works by living scholars could be just as hazardous, like the incendiary poetry of Walther von der Vogelweide, which mocked papal corruption and circulated in whispered recitations before being hastily transcribed. The stakes were unimaginably high. In Florence, the punishment for possessing a banned book might be a fine, while in Granada under the Almohads it meant public burning of both the text and its owner. Yet the trade persisted because scribes and collectors shared a quiet understanding. Knowledge refused to be owned. A single surviving copy of a condemned work, hidden in a cellar or buried in a garden, could be resurrected decades later when regimes changed and minds opened. Like the palimpsests they sometimes wrote on, history's erased ideas always lingered just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be read anew. What's most striking isn't the risks these shadow scribes took, it's how often they won. The very texts authorities tried hardest to destroy often survived in greater numbers than approved works, thanks to the devotion of underground networks. When the Renaissance finally dawned, many of its rediscovered classics hadn't been lost at all. They'd been hiding in plain sight, passed hand to hand like embers kept alive in a storm. Every banned book that resurfaced was proof of a truth power never quite grasped. Ideas don't burn. They scatter on the wind, finding fertile ground in minds hungry enough to receive them. Authorities didn't just fear rebellion, they feared books. In an age where literacy was power, controlling the written word meant controlling thought itself. Kings, bishops, and caliphs all understood this, deploying armies of censors to patrol the scriptoria where scribes worked. Official lists of banned texts circulated like wanted posters, naming everything from heretical gospels to scientific treatises that contradicted doctrine. But censorship wasn't just about burning books, it was a subtle art of shaping reality. A scribe copying a chronicle might find himself instructed to adjust dates to legitimize a ruler's shaky claim to the throne, or to omit entire battles where the king's forces had been humiliated. Even seemingly harmless texts like herbals or star charts could be deemed dangerous if they hinted at knowledge that challenged divine authority. The machinery of control was astonishingly sophisticated. In medieval universities, appointed correctors reviewed every manuscript before it could be copied, blackening out offending passages with thick ink or slicing away entire pages. Some institutions required scribes to swear oaths, pledging never to reproduce works critical of the church or crown. The most paranoid rulers, like England's Henry II, established royal scriptoria where every word produced was vetted by loyal clerics. Even the parchment itself could be weaponized. Authorities in some regions controlled access to high-quality vellum, ensuring that only approved texts looked prestigious enough to be taken seriously. Yet for every restriction, scribes found loopholes. Some became masters of coded language, embedding dissent in seemingly pious works. A biblical commentary might include a veiled critique of tyranny by praising ancient Hebrew kings who listened to wise counsel, a pointed contrast to contemporary rulers. Others practiced the art of selective copying, reproducing only the safe portions of controversial texts while smuggling the rest separately. The luckiest worked for wealthy patrons who turned a blind eye, like the Italian noblewoman who funded a scriptorium dedicated to preserving Greek philosophy, shielding her scribes behind her family's political influence. The penalties for defiance were brutal. In 1231, the Archbishop of Paris ordered 24 wagonloads of captured Jewish texts burned in the city square, a warning to anyone trafficking in unauthorized knowledge. Scribes caught with forbidden works faced everything from excommunication to execution. Their hands, those dangerous tools of thought, sometimes severed as punishment. But the greatest risk wasn't death, it was oblivion. Every suppressed book represented a thread snipped from the tapestry of human understanding, a loss we can't even measure because the ideas vanished before they could be recorded. What's chilling is how often censorship backfired. The very act of banning a text could seal its fame as underground demand soared. When the church condemned the works of the philosopher Abelard, students covertly traded fragments like relics, ensuring his ideas spread further than they ever would have unchallenged. Even the Index of Prohibited Books, the church's master list of forbidden works, became an accidental bestseller guide for Renaissance collectors seeking the most provocative reads. In trying to erase ideas, authorities often etched them deeper into history. The scribes who resisted this machinery understood something profound. Censorship isn't just about controlling the present, it's an attempt to rewrite the future. Every time they saved a condemned text, they were placing a bet against tyranny, trusting that someday someone would need the words they'd risked everything to preserve. History often paints medieval scribes as hooded monks bent over parchment, but look closer between the lines and in the margins, and you'll find another story. Women, though barred from universities and rarely granted official titles, were the silent architects of knowledge's survival. In convents across Europe, noblewomen and abbesses wielded quills with the same precision as their male counterparts, copying liturgical texts, translating poetry, and even composing original works. Take Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness who not only transcribed Latin classics but wrote her own plays, the first known female playwright since antiquity. Or the anonymous nuns of Los Huelgas in Spain, whose illuminated manuscripts rivaled those of any royal scriptorium. Their work wasn't just decorative, it was defiance in ink. Convents became unexpected hubs of female scholarship. While the outside world dismissed women's intellect, these cloistered communities turned their isolation into an advantage. With no male scribes to monopolize education, nuns taught each other, passing down calligraphy techniques and translation skills through generations. The Benedictine convent of Helfte in Germany operated like a medieval think tank, where scribe nuns produced theological treatises and scientific commentaries under the guidance of mystics like Mechthild of Magdeburg. Their manuscripts didn't just copy male-approved knowledge, they expanded it, incorporating herbal remedies, midwifery guides, and even critiques of church hierarchy that would have been banned in male-dominated spaces. But women's contributions weren't confined to convents. In royal courts, literate noblewomen like Elena of Aquitaine and her granddaughter Blanche of Castile maintained personal scriptoria, commissioning and sometimes even copying texts themselves. Jewish women in Mediterranean communities, though excluded from formal religious study, often mastered multiple languages to assist their merchant husbands, translating business documents and preserving secular literature. And in Islamic Spain, female calligraphers like Lubna of Cordoba curated the vast libraries of the Caliphate, their delicate hands shaping the very texts that would later fuel the European Renaissance. What's heartbreaking is how easily their legacies were erased. A nun's manuscript might bear no name, credited simply to the sisters of such and such abbey. A noblewoman's translations could be attributed to male scholars in her employ. Even when women signed their work, later catalogers often assumed it was a man's name, like the 15th century scribe Margaret the Lame, whose painstakingly beautiful Bibles were later catalogued under Magister Gerardus, until someone noticed the tiny Filia daughter beside her signature. The few traces we have survive almost by accident. A doodled self-portrait in a margin, a colophon thanking the sisters who labored with me, or a bitter complaint from a monk about women who write too boldly. Yet their influence seeped into history anyway. When we read a medieval recipe for ink that includes rosewater, a distinctly feminine touch, or find a medical text with unusually detailed advice on childbirth, we're likely glimpsing a woman's hand. The very fact that Hildegard of Bingen's scientific works survived at all, despite their unorthodox ideas, proves how networks of female scribes secretly preserved what the establishment tried to suppress. Their story isn't just about who held the quill, it's about who decided what knowledge was worth remembering and who fought to make sure no voice was left unheard. By the 12th century, a revolution was brewing not in castles or battlefields, but in crowded lecture halls where students jostled for space on wooden benches. Universities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford weren't just schools, they were knowledge factories, and scribes were the gears that kept them running. Imagine a bustling stationer's stall near the University of Paris, stacked with quills, ink pots, and piles of loose parchment. A student rushes in, desperate for a copy of Aristotle's latest assigned text before tomorrow's lecture. The scribe quotes a price, 3 months' rent for a single volume, and the student groans but pays, knowing failure to keep up could cost him his degree. This was the birth of academia as we know it, where education became a currency and scribes held the mint. The demand was unprecedented. Before universities, books were rare treasures, copied slowly in monasteries for elite patrons. Now, suddenly, hundreds of students needed identical texts fast. Scribes adapted with ruthless efficiency. They pioneered the Picia system, breaking manuscripts into sections rented out to multiple copyists working simultaneously. A single prized textbook could be disassembled into quires, each loaned to different scribes who replicated their portion in days rather than months. Stationers kept master copies under lock and key, charging fees per page copied. For the first time, knowledge wasn't just preserved, it was mass-produced, creating an entire economy around speed and accuracy. But this shift came with trade-offs. Monastic scribes had labored for God's glory. University scribes worked for wages. A Parisian copyist might churn out 10 pages a day, his pay docked for every smudged letter. Quality suffered as shortcuts emerged, abbreviations crowded margins. Intricate illuminations gave way to bare-bones diagrams. Some scribes, overwhelmed by demand, silently skipped challenging passages rather than admit they couldn't decipher them. Texts mutated rapidly as errors compounded through generations of copies, creating variations so stark that professors sometimes debated which version was correct. Universities didn't just change how books were made, they reshaped who controlled knowledge. In monasteries, abbots decided what got copied. Now, professors dictated reading lists and scribes scrambled to meet their whims. When Thomas Aquinas's commentaries became required reading, stationers hired teams to replicate them overnight. Legal scholars in Bologna created a roaring trade in Roman law texts, while medical students in Salerno fueled demand for Arabic anatomy manuals. The most successful scribes weren't just copyists, they were savvy entrepreneurs who tracked academic trends, stockpiling popular texts before demand spiked. Yet this commercial frenzy had an unexpected upside: diversity. Unlike monastic libraries bound by religious orthodoxy, universities craved controversy. Scribes copied heretical philosophers alongside church fathers, knowing debate drove sales. Jewish translators found steady work rendering Arabic scientific texts into Latin for medical students, while women like Jacoba Felici, though barred from degrees, ran scriptoria supplying the very books male students needed. The marketplace of ideas wasn't a metaphor, it was a literal economy where scribes connected buyers and sellers across ideological divides, the real legacy of this era. Standardization. As universities grew, so did the need for consistency. Scribes developed uniform citation styles, page layouts, even handwriting conventions to ease cross-referencing. Footnotes appeared, allowing scholars to trace arguments through multiple texts. The chaotic creativity of monastic marginalia gave way to orderly glosses in the sentences of Peter Lombard, the medieval equivalent of a best-selling textbook. What emerged was the skeleton of modern academic publishing, a system where knowledge wasn't just stored, but organized for rapid exchange. For all its flaws, this university-driven model proved astonishingly resilient. When the Black Death wiped out a third of Europe's population, scribes didn't vanish, they adapted, producing cheaper paper manuscripts to replace costly parchment volumes as budgets shrank. When the printing press arrived centuries later, it didn't erase scribes but absorbed them, with many becoming early typesetters. The lesson was clear: once knowledge became a commodity, there was no going back. The scribes who powered this revolution may have worked in shadows, but they lit the path to the modern world. For centuries, parchment had been the undisputed king of writing materials, durable, prestigious, and prohibitively expensive. Then came paper, slipping into Europe through the back door of trade routes from China and the Islamic world. At first, it was seen as a cheap substitute, the medieval equivalent of knockoff goods. But this humble material, made from pulped rags and plant fibers, would ignite a revolution as profound as the Internet's impact on our own era. Imagine a 14th century bookseller's shock when he realized a single sheet of parchment, costing as much as a laborer's daily wage, could be replaced by paper at a fraction of the price. Suddenly, books weren't just for princes and prelates, they were within reach of merchants, students, even skilled artisans. The shift wasn't just about cost. Paper transformed the very rhythm of knowledge. Parchment required careful planning. Every scrape of the knife to correct an error was permanent. Paper, with its forgiving surface, allowed scribes to draft, revise, and experiment freely. Scholars could now afford personal notebooks, jotting down half-formed ideas that might one day reshape entire fields. The Italian poet Petrarch famously scribbled his drafts on paper scraps, something unimaginable with precious vellum. This wasn't just a new material, it was a new mindset, knowledge as something fluid, evolving, and democratic. Yet resistance ran deep. Many monasteries clung to parchment for sacred texts, convinced paper was too fragile for God's word. Legal documents continued to use vellum well into the Renaissance, its thickness seen as proof against forgery. Even Gutenberg printed his first Bibles on both materials, hedging his bets between tradition and innovation. The parallels to our digital age are striking. Remember how skeptics insisted printed books could never replace handwritten manuscripts, or how some today still prefer physical books over e-readers. Technological revolutions always leave stragglers in their wake. What's often overlooked is how paper fueled niche markets. Cheap pamphlets spread news of miracles and scandals, the medieval clickbait that kept the masses hooked. Artists used paper for preparatory sketches, leading to an explosion of creativity as they could now afford to make mistakes. Even bureaucracy ballooned as town clerks switched from expensive parchment rolls to paper ledgers, documenting everything from tax payments to pub brawls. The ripple effects were endless: the rise of personal diaries, the standardization of musical notation, even the birth of early newspapers. The real game changer, though, was volume. A single parchment Bible required the skins of 200 sheep. The same text on paper needed just rags from a few old tunics. This scalability meant ideas could spread faster and farther than ever before. When the plague ravaged Europe, paper made medical manuals circulated vital, if sometimes questionable, advice on prevention. Political manifestos printed on paper leaflets fueled peasant revolts. The church, once the gatekeeper of knowledge, now faced reformers armed with affordable paper Bibles in local languages. Sound familiar? It's the same disruption we've seen with digital media, once centralized authorities struggling to control a flood of decentralized information. But paper had its dark side. The same affordability that democratized knowledge also flooded markets with errors. Rushed copies of Aristotle's works circulated with entire paragraphs missing or garbled. Unscrupulous scribes peddled counterfeit classics, stitching together fragments from different authors. The equivalent of medieval fake news spread via cheap broadsheets, their wild claims inked on paper too flimsy to last. Scholars complained of an information overload eerily reminiscent of modern gripes about the internet. The more accessible knowledge became, the harder it was to separate signal from noise. Perhaps the most telling comparison lies in how both paper and digital revolutions forced societies to redefine value. When books were rare, their worth was in their physical form, the gold leaf, the ivory covers. Paper made the content king, just as digital media today shifts value from ownership to access. A student in 15th century Florence might rent a paper textbook for a semester, just as we now stream movies instead of buying DVDs. The medium changed, but the human hunger for connection, for stories, for understanding remained and still does. Every time you swipe an e-reader or fold a paper bookmark into a novel, you're part of a chain that stretches back to those first hesitant scribes dipping their pens into inkwells, wondering if this flimsy new material might just change the world. Some scribes never stayed put. While many labored in the steady glow of monastery scriptoriums, others lived with ink-stained hands and rode weary feet, carrying knowledge from city to city like human libraries. These itinerant scribes were the medieval equivalent of startup founders always on the move, trading expertise for patronage and building networks that spanned continents. Picture a man trudging along the Via Francigena, his satchel heavy with freshly copied medical texts from Salerno, bound for a university in Paris where professors would pay handsomely for the latest Arabic translations. Or a Jewish scholar navigating the Silk Roads, his fluency in Persian, Hebrew, and Latin making him indispensable to merchants and monarchs alike. Their journeys weren't just about survival, they were the lifelines of intellectual exchange. What drove these wandering scribes to such a precarious existence? For some, it was necessity. A political upheaval might close a local scriptorium, or a plague could decimate a town's scholarly community, leaving skilled copyists no choice but to seek work elsewhere. Others were lured by opportunity, like the Greek scribes who fled Constantinople after its fall in 1453, carrying priceless classical manuscripts to Italian courts eager to pay for their knowledge. But the most fascinating were the true adventurers, those who traveled not just for gold but for the thrill of discovery. Gerard of Cremona, the legendary 12th century translator, reportedly journeyed to Toledo specifically to find Ptolemy's Almagest, a text so revered he learned Arabic just to access it. He stayed for decades, producing translations that would redefine European science. The routes these scribes followed read like a map of medieval globalization. Benedictine monks traveled between sister monasteries along the Camino de Santiago, exchanging liturgical texts and news. Jewish scribes moved fluidly across the Mediterranean, their multilingual skills making them bridges between Islamic and Christian centers of learning. Even the Mongol conquests, often remembered for their brutality, created unexpected highways for knowledge. Persian scribes found employment in Karakorum, while Chinese paper-making techniques spread westward through these very networks. The most sought-after itinerants developed specialties, like the Irish scribes renowned for their intricate illuminations, hired by wealthy patrons from Auchan to Canterbury. But life on the road was far from glamorous. A traveling scribe faced bandits, rotten food, and suspicious locals who might accuse him of witchcraft for carrying strange symbols. Without fixed patrons, payment was erratic. One might barter a copied Aristotle for a month's lodging, only to sleep in stables the next week. Some carried letters of introduction from bishops or kings, while others relied on guild connections or sheer charisma. The smartest cultivated relationships with monastic guest houses, where a warm bed and a scribe's desk awaited in exchange for copying the abbey's worn-out prayer books. Their legacy lies in the unexpected connections they forged. A marginal note in a Bavarian manuscript might reveal that the ink was mixed with saffron, a spice only available through trade with Islamic Spain. A sudden shift in handwriting style in a French legal text could signal the arrival of a Lombard scribe fleeing war. Even mistakes told stories. A scribe copying a text in a language he barely understood might leave telltale errors, like translating Arabic kitmir, a type of resin, as cat fur in a medical recipe. These weren't just errors, they were fingerprints of a world in motion. The most successful itinerants became living archives, their memories as valuable as the texts they carried. A scribe who'd worked in Baghdad might recite Persian poetry at a Venetian dinner party, then sketch the latest water-lifting devices he'd seen in Cairo. In an age before search engines, these human databases were irreplaceable. When the scholar Alcuin was recruited by Charlemagne, he didn't just bring books, he brought decades of accumulated knowledge about British, Roman, and Frankish traditions, shaping an empire's intellectual rebirth. What's astonishing is how these networks outlasted individuals. A scribe might die penniless on some forgotten road, but the texts he copied would continue their journey, passing through dozens of hands across centuries. The travels of Marco Polo, dictated to a scribe in a Genoese prison, would eventually inspire Columbus. A medical manual carried from Damascus to Montpellier might save lives in London generations later. These weren't just couriers, they were the original viral vectors of ideas, proving that knowledge, once set loose in the world, could never truly be contained. While Europe's monasteries guarded fragments of classical knowledge like candles in the wind, Baghdad blazed with the light of 1,000 lanterns. At the heart of this intellectual inferno stood the House of Wisdom, an institution so ambitious it made modern universities look modest. Founded in the early 9th century by the Abbasid Caliph Al-Ma'mun, this wasn't just a library or a scriptorium. It was a full-scale knowledge factory where Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and Zoroastrian scholars worked side by side, translating, debating, and innovating at a pace the world hadn't seen since Alexandria. Here, scribes weren't just copyists, they were engineers of thought, taking raw materials from Greece, Persia, and India, and refining them into something entirely new. The scale of their operation was staggering. Teams of translators worked in shifts, rendering entire libraries of Greek philosophy, Persian astronomy, and Indian mathematics into Arabic. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Nestorian Christian physician, became legendary for his method. Rather than translating word for word, he'd first absorb the full meaning of a Greek medical text, then rewrite it in clear, elegant Arabic that even students could grasp. His translations of Galen's works didn't just preserve ancient medicine, they improved upon it, with added diagrams and commentary that made the texts more useful than the originals. Meanwhile, mathematicians like the Banu Musa brothers were doing something revolutionary. They weren't just copying Euclid's geometry, they were extending it, solving problems the Greeks had deemed impossible. What set the House of Wisdom apart wasn't just its diversity or resources, it was its hunger for the unfinished. While European monks focused on preserving sacred texts, Baghdad scholars sought out works that posed unanswered questions. When they acquired Ptolemy's Almagest, they didn't stop at marveling at its star charts. They built observatories to check his calculations, discovering errors that had stood unchallenged for centuries. A translated Indian text on arithmetic introduced the numeral 0, a concept so radical that scribes initially left blank spaces in manuscripts rather than risk heresy by writing a symbol for nothingness. Yet within decades, these same scribes were using 0 to develop algebra, a discipline so transformative it would later enable everything from architecture to astronomy. The logistics of this knowledge economy were breathtaking. Caliphs sponsored expeditions to Byzantine monasteries, paying in gold for forgotten Greek manuscripts. Caravans arriving from India carried not just spices but palm leaf manuscripts on trigonometry, which scribes meticulously copied onto durable paper, a technology recently imported from China. Even the physical space reflected their values. The House of Wisdom had dedicated rooms for debates, where scholars would argue over Aristotle's physics while scribes recorded every objection and insight in real time. These weren't dry academic exercises, they were high-stakes intellectual showdowns with reputations and sometimes lives hanging in the balance. Yet for all its brilliance, the House of Wisdom was never just about the elite. Scribes produced popular summaries of complex texts for physicians and engineers, creating what we now call quick reference guides. Street vendors sold affordable paper copies of poetry and scientific primers, making Baghdad the first city where knowledge wasn't just hoarded by the powerful, it was a commodity anyone could buy. When a mathematician named Al-Khwarizmi systematized algebra, scribes made sure his work spread to market towns and remote villages, transforming how merchants calculated profits and farmers measured land. The tragedy, of course, is how much was lost when the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258. Survivors spoke of the Tigris running black with ink from drowned manuscripts and of flames consuming centuries of work in days. But the legacy couldn't be erased so easily. Decades before the fall, scribes had already carried copies of the house's greatest works to places like Cordoba, Cairo, and Toledo. A single surviving text on optics by Ibn al-Haytham would later inspire Renaissance artists to master perspective. Medical encyclopedias smuggled out in the chaos became standard textbooks at European universities. The House of Wisdom's real triumph wasn't just what it achieved, but how unstoppable its ideas proved, even in the face of destruction. While Baghdad's House of Wisdom and Europe's monasteries dominated the narrative of medieval knowledge, another tradition thrived in the shadows, one just as vital but far less celebrated. Jewish scribes working in cramped yeshivas and bustling market towns became the unsung archivists of civilizations, preserving not only their own sacred texts but acting as bridges between cultures that otherwise refused to speak. Picture a dimly lit room in 11th century Toledo, where a rabbi scribe dips his quill into iron gall ink, carefully copying a Hebrew commentary on Aristotle, but pausing every few lines to jot marginal notes in Arabic for his Muslim patron, then in Latin for the Christian scholar who commissioned the work. This wasn't just translation, it was high-wire diplomacy in ink where every stroke carried the weight of survival. The Jewish scribble tradition was born of necessity. With no homeland and constant persecution, Jewish communities treated texts as portable homelands, every Torah scroll a sacred compact, every philosophical manuscript a lifeline to future generations. While Christian monks copied primarily for institutional libraries, Jewish scribes worked for dispersed communities who might need to flee at a moment's notice. Their books had to be durable yet compact, meticulously accurate yet adaptable. A Torah scribe or sofer would follow exacting rituals, checking each letter against a master copy, using only kosher ink and parchment, even pausing to wash his hands every time he wrote God's name. A single error could render an entire scroll unfit for use, a standard of precision that put monastic scriptoria to shame, but their genius lay in multilingualism. Jewish traders and scholars moved fluidly between Christian, Muslim, and pagan worlds, making them ideal knowledge brokers. In Provence, scribes like Jacob ben Machir translated Arabic astronomy texts into Hebrew, then collaborated with Christian monks to render them into Latin. In Cairo's Ben Ezra synagogue, scribes preserved not only Talmudic commentaries but Greek medical texts that had vanished elsewhere, their margins filled with debates between Jewish, Islamic, and Christian interpretations. The famous Cairo Geniza, a storeroom for damaged sacred texts, became an accidental time capsule, preserving everything from marriage contracts to merchant ledgers that reveal how scribes facilitated cross-cultural trade in ideas. Their most daring role was as preservers of forbidden knowledge. When the Visigoths ordered Jewish texts burned in 7th century Spain, scribes smuggled them out hidden in wine barrels. During the Almohad persecutions, they disguised philosophical works as biblical commentaries, knowing invaders wouldn't recognize Maimonides' radical ideas beneath traditional formatting. Some even mastered the art of micrography, transcribing entire texts in decorative patterns so tiny they resembled mere page borders, creating books that were both beautiful and subversive. What's often overlooked is how Jewish scribes shaped secular thought. While monasteries focused on scripture, Jewish scholars copied and annotated Greek logic, Persian mathematics, and Arabic medicine. The Tibonid family of translators in southern France didn't just render texts, they created a new Hebrew scientific vocabulary, coining terms for concepts like gravity and astrolabe that didn't exist in biblical language. When Christian Europe rediscovered Aristotle in the 12th century, many of the new texts had actually survived thanks to Hebrew translations made centuries earlier in Baghdad. The cruel irony, these same scribes who saved so much are rarely named in the histories they preserved. A medieval Christian chronicle might grudgingly admit a Jewish translator assisted with a medical text, while Muslim sources often referred to them collectively as the people of the book. Yet their fingerprints are everywhere in the star charts Columbus used, the legal principles that shaped merchant guilds, even the recipe books of Renaissance apothecaries. They proved that knowledge, when carried carefully, could outlast empires. While Western Europe struggled through the so-called Dark Ages, a parallel story of intellectual heroism unfolded in the East, where Byzantine scribes, working under the domes of Constantinople, became the unsung saviors of classical Greek thought. Imagine a scriptorium in the Great Palace, where lamplight flickered off golden mosaics as teams of scholars pored over crumbling manuscripts of Plato and Aristotle. These weren't mere copyists, they were curators of a legacy, painstakingly preserving texts that had already vanished from the rest of Europe. While Charlemagne's courtiers were still mastering basic literacy, Byzantine scholars were debating the finer points of Thucydides and Archimedes, their quills racing against time to save wisdom from oblivion. The Byzantines had an advantage: they never stopped speaking Greek. While Latin fragmented into regional dialects in the West, the scholars of Constantinople maintained direct linguistic continuity with Homer and Sophocles. This meant they could read ancient texts without translation, a privilege that turned every monastery and imperial library into a time capsule of classical knowledge. But preservation wasn't passive. Scribes like Arethas of Caesarea didn't just replicate texts, they annotated them with meticulous commentaries, cross-referencing versions to weed out centuries of copyists' errors. When Arethas discovered a damaged manuscript of Plato's Laws, he didn't discard it, he tracked down 2 other copies from distant monasteries, creating a critical edition that would later become the foundation for Renaissance printings. Their methods were systematic to the point of obsession. Imperial workshops employed specialized scribes for different tasks, some focused on mathematical diagrams, others on poetic meter or philosophical terminology. A single manuscript might pass through 4 hands: a proofreader to check accuracy, a grammarian to ensure proper Attic Greek, an illuminator to add diagrams, and finally a binder who stitched the pages between wooden covers stamped with the imperial seal. This wasn't just bookmaking, it was intellectual triage, prioritizing the most endangered texts first. Euclid's Elements was copied so frequently that Byzantine editions outnumbered all other surviving ancient scientific works combined. Yet their greatest contribution was strategic rescue. As the Byzantine Empire shrank under pressure from Crusaders and Ottomans, scholars orchestrated a clandestine evacuation of knowledge. In the 14th century, diplomat scholars like Manuel Chrysoloras began smuggling manuscripts to Italy, where hungry humanists awaited them. A single trunk carried to Florence in 1397 contained lost speeches by Demosthenes, unknown dialogues of Plato, and Ptolemy's geography, texts that would fuel the Florentine Renaissance. Other scribes employed subtler tactics. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the scholar Cardinal Bessarion had already donated his personal library of 800 Greek manuscripts to Venice, ensuring their survival under the Republic's protection. What's often overlooked is how Byzantine scribes shaped the texts they saved. Marginal notes in surviving manuscripts reveal fierce debates. A scribe might challenge Aristotle's physics based on newer observations, or correct a geographical error in Strabo's Geographica using contemporary maps. These weren't neutral transmissions, they were conversations across time, with each generation of scribes adding layers of insight. When Renaissance scholars like Marsilio Ficino finally read these annotated texts, they weren't just rediscovering antiquity, they were inheriting a living tradition of critique and reinterpretation. The bitter irony, many of these scribes died unnamed, their labor credited only to the emperors or bishops who commissioned the work, yet their legacy is unmistakable. Every time we quote Aristotle's Ethics or admire a Renaissance painting inspired by Greek aesthetics, we're touching the fruits of a rescue mission that lasted 1,000 years. The Byzantines didn't just save books, they kept the flame of rational inquiry alive through centuries when much of the world had turned away from it. And when that flame finally passed to Italy, it didn't just flicker, it ignited the modern world. When Johannes Gutenberg unveiled his printing press in the mid-15th century, the world braced for revolution, but few anticipated how messy the transition would be. The common tale paints scribes as casualties of progress, their quills snapped by the relentless gears of mechanization. Yet the truth is far more fascinating. Scribes didn't vanish, they adapted, finding niches where the press couldn't yet compete. Picture a bustling print shop in Mainz, its wooden presses churning out Bibles by the dozen, while just down the street, a master scribe gilds an illuminated manuscript for a noble client who scoffs at mass-produced books. This wasn't extinction, it was evolution. Early printed books, or incarnabula, were crude compared to the scribble artistry of the ages. The press struggled with intricate illustrations, forcing printers to leave blank spaces for illuminators to fill by hand. Wealthy patrons, accustomed to bespoke volumes, often commissioned scribes to add custom touches, gold leaf initials, hand-painted coats of arms, even personalized marginalia. In Spain, the tradition of lettres de molde emerged, where printed texts were meticulously hand-finished to resemble manuscripts, easing conservative readers into the new technology. For decades, the two worlds coexisted, with scribes becoming the haute couture tailors of the book trade while printers handled the ready-to-wear market. But scribes didn't just cling to luxury work, they became the printing press's unlikely collaborators. Printers hired them as proofreaders, relying on their sharp eyes to catch errors in type. Skilled calligraphers designed the first fonts, their handwriting styles immortalized in metal. In Venice, scribe-turned-publisher Aldus Manutius revolutionized printing by mimicking the compact script scholars used in their personal notebooks, creating portable books that fit in a saddlebag. The press didn't erase scribble skills, it repurposed them. The real surprise was how scribes leveraged their old networks. Monastic scriptoria, once the heart of book production, became distribution hubs for printed works. A Benedictine monk might now hand copy only sacred texts for liturgy, but use his connections to sell printed grammars to local schools. Jewish scribes, long accustomed to working across linguistic divides, became vital middlemen, sourcing Hebrew typefaces from one city and selling printed Talmuds to communities another press wouldn't serve. Even the church, initially wary of printing, soon employed scribes to index and catalogue the flood of new books, turning them into the first librarians of the information age. Yet the shift wasn't painless. In cities like Paris, guilds of scribes protested as their wages plummeted, some even sabotaging printed books by smearing ink on sheets left to dry in public squares. Others pivoted to forgery, using their skills to create counterfeit editions of lucrative texts. But the most resourceful scribes became early content creators, writing newsletters for merchants, compiling custom almanacs, or penning original works too niche for mass production. A scribe in Nuremberg might produce a handwritten guide to local mining laws, while another in Florence chronicled gossip about the Medici family, creating the precursors to modern magazines. The printing press didn't kill scribes, it forced them to reinvent what knowledge looked like. By the time the last monastic scriptorium closed, their legacy had already seeped into the very fabric of print, from the fonts we still use to the way we organize ideas on a page. The scribes who adapted didn't just survive, they helped shape the rules of a game that's still being played today. Every time we choose between a paperback and an e-book, or debate what's lost when convenience trumps craftsmanship. Their story isn't about obsolescence, it's about resilience, proving that even revolutions need translators. Walk into any modern library, and you're stepping into a legacy shaped by medieval scribes, those tireless guardians of words who turned fragile knowledge into something that could outlast empires. The hushed aisles, the carefully catalogued shelves, even the way we organize information today all trace back to innovations born in candlelit scriptoria and bustling university stalls. Consider the Library of Congress with its millions of volumes. It may seem worlds apart from a Benedictine monk copying psalms by hand, but the core mission is identical: to preserve, organize, and share wisdom across generations. The difference scale: where a medieval monastery might boast a few hundred precious manuscripts, today's digital archives can hold billions of texts, yet the spirit of that work remains unchanged. One of the most direct inheritances is the very structure of our libraries. Medieval scribes didn't just copy texts, they developed systems to make them usable. The Picia system, where books were broken into sections for simultaneous copying, foreshadowed modern interlibrary loans, those intricate illuminated initials in manuscripts. They evolved into today's subject headings and call numbers, helping readers navigate vast collections. Even the concept of a reference section has roots in the glossed Bibles and legal commentaries scribes created, where marginal notes served as early footnotes for scholars. The Vatican Library's ancient practice of chaining books to desks may seem draconian, but it mirrors modern digital rights management. Both are attempts to balance access with preservation. Preservation itself is where the connection grows profound. Modern conservators still use techniques pioneered by medieval scribes, from humidity-controlled environments inspired by the dry, dark conditions of monastic vaults to the delicate repair of fragile pages. When the British Library painstakingly restores a crumbling medieval manuscript, they're often relying on recipes for glue and ink recorded in the margins of those very texts. Even disaster preparedness has medieval parallels. After the 2010 flood in Florence's National Library, rescuers used freeze-drying techniques to save waterlogged books, a crisis medieval scribes would have understood all too well, having faced fires, wars, and the gnawing teeth of time. But the most striking legacy lies in the philosophy of access. Medieval scribes, especially those in universities, fought to make knowledge available beyond elite circles, just as public libraries do today. The stationers who rented textbooks to cash-strapped students in Bologna would nod in recognition at modern library cards offering free e-books. And when digital archivists race to digitize crumbling newspapers or endangered languages, they're continuing the work of Jewish scribes who smuggled texts through persecutions, and Byzantine scholars who smuggled Greek classics to Italy as their empire fell. The tools have changed, but the goal hasn't: to ensure no idea is lost simply because someone lacked the wealth or power to protect it. Perhaps the most poignant link is in the gaps we're still trying to fill. Just as medieval scribes agonized over which texts to save when vellum ran short, today's librarians face impossible choices about what to digitize with limited budgets. The Lost Libraries exhibit at Cambridge, showcasing fragments of books destroyed by time, mirrors the digital decay eating away at early websites and file formats. In both eras, the real challenge isn't just storing knowledge, it's deciding whose stories get remembered. Every time a modern archiver rescues a community's oral history or a migrant's diary, they're honoring the same impulse that drove a nameless scribe to preserve a forbidden herbal remedy or a heretical poem. The next time you tap a library app or wander the stacks, look closer. Those digital catalogues, they're the grandchildren of medieval library inventories scratched onto wax tablets. The open access movement, a direct descendant of scribes who believed wisdom belonged to humanity, not just to kings, and the fragile scrolls now carefully scanned into online databases. They're proof that a chain of care stretches back over 1,000 years, held together by hands that understood words could be as eternal as stone, if only someone took the time to pass them on. The glow of a smartphone screen is the new candlelight, and the keyboard's click-clack has replaced the scratch of quills on parchment, but the essence of the scribe's work hasn't vanished. It's evolved. Today's content creators, from YouTubers to bloggers, are the spiritual heirs of those medieval knowledge brokers, navigating an equally chaotic landscape of information, gatekeepers, and rapidly shifting technologies. Like the scribe who once balanced the demands of a bishop, a merchant, and a university scholar, modern creators juggle algorithms, sponsors, and audiences, all while trying to preserve something meaningful in the digital deluge. Consider the parallels. Medieval scribes curated knowledge, deciding which texts to copy and which to let fade, a power now wielded by influencers and media platforms. A TikTok creator distilling complex science into 60-second clips isn't so different from a monk abridging Aristotle for busy students. Both face the same dilemma: simplify too much and the truth gets lost, cling too tightly to complexity and no one listens. Even the economics echo across centuries. Just as scribes depended on patrons, kings, monasteries, wealthy merchants, today's creators rely on sponsorships and ad revenue, trading visibility for survival in an attention economy as unforgiving as any medieval marketplace. The tools may have changed, but the risks feel eerily familiar. A scribe smuggling forbidden texts past censors would recognize the tactics of journalists in oppressive regimes, publishing under pseudonyms or encoding messages in harmless-seeming posts. Viral misinformation spreads like medieval broadsheets filled with rumors of sea monsters or divine omens, while fact-checkers play the role of those long-ago scholars who painstakingly compared manuscript versions to weed out errors. And just as parchment manuscripts were vulnerable to fire and flood, digital knowledge faces its own existential threats: link rot, platform collapses, and the fragile lifespan of storage devices that could render entire archives unreadable in a generation. Yet there's hope in the continuity. Open-source software developers collaborating across continents mirror the Scribble networks of Baghdad and Cordoba, where scholars pooled insights across religious divides. Wikipedia's volunteer editors are the Benedictine monks of our age, building a shared repository of knowledge without pay, driven by faith in the collective good. Even the resurgence of niche newsletters and podcasts recalls the itinerant scribes who catered to specialized audiences, astrologers, alchemists, legal scholars, long before the printing press standardized mass media. The lesson buried in these parallels is urgent. Medieval scribes didn't just adapt to new technologies like paper or the printing press, they shaped how those tools would change society. Today's creators stand at a similar crossroads. Will we let algorithms dictate what knowledge survives, or will we, like the scribes before us, become stewards of what matters? The quills are gone, but the choices remain: what to preserve, what to amplify, and what to risk saying aloud. The scripts have changed, but not the stakes. Lost texts haunt history like ghosts there, but unseen, shaping our understanding through their absence. Imagine an 11th century monk in a Norman monastery, carefully copying the only surviving manuscript of a Roman agricultural manual. A single spilled candle, a moment's carelessness, and centuries of accumulated wisdom on crop rotation, soil health, and vine cultivation vanish forever. This wasn't just a book lost, it was an entire strand of human ingenuity snipped away. We think of the Middle Ages through what survived: the illuminated Bibles, the Aristotle translations, the royal chronicles. But the real story might lie in what didn't make it: the gaps where scrolls crumbled, libraries burned, or scribes simply chose not to copy works that no longer seemed relevant. Consider the Library of Alexandria, that legendary repository of ancient knowledge. Its destruction is often mourned as the great vanishing point of classical wisdom. But equally tragic are the quieter losses, the slow, unrecorded disappearances. A Visigoth raid destroys a Spanish monastery's scriptorium, taking with it the last copy of a Carthaginian medical treatise. A Byzantine scholar's personal library, packed with unique commentaries on Plato, sinks in a storm en route to Italy. Even deliberate decisions had unintended consequences. When Irish monks prioritized copying scripture over pagan poetry, entire traditions of Celtic mythology faded into fragments. The holes in our knowledge aren't random. They're the scars left by war, prejudice, and the cruel arithmetic of survival. Some losses distort history itself. Take the Annals of Tacitus, one of our most important sources for early imperial Rome. Of its original 16 books, only 4.5 survive intact. The missing sections, precisely those covering Rome's conquest of Britain and the Great Fire of Nero's reign, events that shaped empires. What we know comes from later summaries, like trying to reconstruct a fresco from its plastered dust. Even when texts technically survive, their context often doesn't. A 9th century herbal might list remedies for elf shot and moon sickness, but without the accompanying oral traditions the scribe assumed his readers knew. We're left guessing what ailments those terms actually described. The greatest tragedy lies in the diversity of voices erased. We have countless medieval theological debates, but almost none of the working-class ballads, women's diaries, or slave narratives that would show how ordinary people lived. A handful of medical texts by women like Trota of Salerno survived by sheer luck, while hundreds of others were dismissed as folk nonsense and left to rot. Jewish and Islamic scientific works, translated into Latin, often had their original authors' names scrubbed away, leaving us with anonymous Arab sources whose full contributions we'll never know. Every missing text isn't just lost information, it's a missing perspective, a silenced way of seeing the world. Yet absence has its own strange power. Those gaps force us to question what we think we know. When archaeologists found the Archimedes palimpsest, a prayer book written over the erased works of the great Greek mathematician, it revealed that Archimedes had essentially invented calculus a millennium before Newton. How many other breakthroughs lie buried under later scribbles? The search for lost texts continues today, with scholars using multispectral imaging to recover words from charred scrolls at Herculaneum, or piecing together fragments from the Cairo Geniza. Each discovery is a reminder that history isn't a fixed story, it's a puzzle with half the pieces still missing, waiting for some future scribe, some digital archivist to stumble upon them and say, "Wait, this changes everything." Knowledge was never just ink on parchment, it was power, and those who controlled its flow shaped empires. In the shadowed scriptoria and bustling market stalls where scribes traded texts, a quiet ethical battle raged. Should wisdom belong to the few who could pay for it, or was it a shared inheritance all deserved to access? Medieval monasteries often locked their libraries, reserving precious manuscripts for clergy and nobility. Universities hoarded textbooks behind steep fees, leaving poorer students to huddle around single copies. Even translations carried biased Arabic medical texts might be stripped of references to Islamic scholars before reaching Christian audiences, erasing credit to make the knowledge more acceptable. This wasn't just practical censorship, it was a deliberate shaping of reality where gatekeepers decided which ideas lived or died, yet dissent flickered in unexpected places. Some scribes, like the anonymous copyist who added marginal notes challenging church doctrine in a French psalter, risked heresy charges to widen debate. Jewish scholars in Toledo operated like intellectual insurgents, translating Greek philosophy into Hebrew and Latin without sanitizing its pagan origins, trusting readers to grapple with complexity. Even the layout of books became a moral choice. Scribes who left wide margins encouraged readers to add their own thoughts, transforming static texts into living conversations. The most radical act, copying forbidden works like the Gospel of Thomas or Averro's Commentaries, then smuggling them into cathedral schools disguised as harmless sermons. These scribes understood what modern open access advocates proclaim: knowledge suppressed is progress delayed. The tension between profit and principle was equally stark. Stationers near universities charged exorbitant rates for textbook rentals, knowing students had no alternatives. A single volume of Justinian's Digest could cost a law scholar 6 months' wages, medieval student debt in parchment form. Yet some scriptoria, like those run by the Franciscans, prioritized affordability, producing cheap paper copies of theological works for rural priests. The difference often came down to patronage. A scribe funded by a wealthy merchant might cater to elites, while one supported by a reformist bishop could flood parishes with affordable liturgy. Control of knowledge wasn't just about ideology, it was economics in disguise. What's haunting is how these medieval dilemmas mirror today's battles over paywalls, patented medicines, and algorithmically restricted information. When a 14th-century Florentine banker paid scribes to copy Greek classics but kept them in a private collection, was he so different from modern corporations locking research behind subscription fees? The scribes who resisted, like those who secretly duplicated texts for underground libraries, would recognize the ethos of today's open-source movements and shadow libraries like Sci-Hub. The core question remains unchanged. Is knowledge a commodity to be sold or a common good to be shared? Perhaps the most profound ethical legacy lies in the scribes who chose what to preserve. Faced with scarce parchment, do you save Cicero's speeches on republicanism or a farming manual that could prevent famine? Copy a royal genealogy flattering your patron or a heretical tract questioning divine right? These weren't theoretical choices, they were daily triage with generational consequences. We'll never know how many radical ideas were lost because a tired monk prioritized a safer text. But we inherit their lesson: preservation is never neutral. every act of copying then and now is a vote for what future generations will remember and what they'll never know existed. Hollywood loves a hooded monk bent over parchment, candlelight flickering as he copies some world-altering secret, but the reality of scribes was far messier and far more interesting than most films dare to show. Take The Name of the Rose, where Sean Connery's monk detective deciphers coded manuscripts in a labyrinthine library. It captures the aura of medieval scriptoria, but misses their gritty pragmatism, the ink-stained fingers, the squabbles over wages, the scribe who doodled grumpy cats in the margins of a psalm. Even Monty Python and the Holy Grail gets closer to the truth with its harried monks chanting Pi Jesu Domine while whacking themselves with boards, a nod to the tedium that filled most scribble days. Fantasy literature often elevates scribes to mystical status. In the Witcher series, the elven scribe Ida Emean acts as a keeper of lost histories, her knowledge a weapon against human erasure of elven culture. It's a romantic vision, but it echoes the real-world Jewish and Byzantine scribes who smuggled texts through persecutions. Yet these portrayals rarely show the physical labor. The backaches from hunching over desks, the eye strain from deciphering faded ink, or the sheer risk of handling fragile parchment that might crumble at a touch. Video games, though, occasionally nail the scribe's dual role as scholar and spy. Assassin's Creed Valhalla features codex pages hidden across Europe, each a fragment of a larger truth, a direct nod to how medieval scribes often worked in fragments, reassembling knowledge piece by piece. Even Skyrim's court historians, jotting down the Dragonborn's deeds, mirror the real chroniclers who balanced flattery of patrons with scraps of inconvenient truth. But where these games falter is in portraying the collaboration behind texts. A single scribe might copy a manuscript, but its journey involved translators, proofreaders, illuminators, a whole network erased when pop culture reduces the process to one cloaked figure in a shadowy cell. The most persistent myth that scribes were passive vessels mechanically copying words without thought. In reality, they were curators, critics, even saboteurs. A Norse saga might be subtly altered to glorify a patron's ancestor. A medical text could be improved with marginal notes from a scribe physician's own practice. Yet when's the last time a movie showed a scribe arguing with a text, crossing out lines, or adding snarky commentary like the famous "Writing is excessive drudgery," scrawled in the margin of an Irish psalter? Perhaps the most telling gap is how rarely female scribes appear in fiction. While Game of Thrones gave us Septa Bartholomew teaching noble girls to read, it skipped the vibrant reality of convents like Helfta, where nuns composed original treatises on science and theology. Even The Nun Story, a film dedicated to monastic life, focuses on prayer and nursing, not the intellectual labor that funded entire abbeys. It's a missed opportunity, especially when historical figures like Hildegard of Bingen wrote medical texts so revolutionary they're still studied today. The irony is thick. The very people who preserved stories are often misremembered in them. But when a rare portrayal gets it right, like the exhausted, ink-smeared scribe in the Pillars of the Earth bargaining for better wages, we glimpse the truth. These weren't just background figures in history's grand drama. They were the stagehands holding the lights, ensuring the show could go on. The medieval scriptorium and the modern server room may seem worlds apart, but the challenges at the heart of knowledge economies remain strikingly familiar. Those scribes hunched over parchment faced dilemmas we recognize instantly: how to balance access with control, preserve truth amid chaos, and protect fragile wisdom from the twin dangers of suppression and neglect. Their solutions, sometimes brilliant, sometimes flawed, hold up a mirror to our own digital age, revealing patterns we'd be foolish to ignore. consider the paradox of scarcity and abundance. Medieval scribes worked in an era of extreme information scarcity, where a single lost manuscript could erase centuries of thought. Today, we drown in data, yet face a similar crisis, not from lack of knowledge, but from its overwhelming volume and fragility. Like the monk who had to choose between copying a medical treatise or a philosophical text when parchment ran short, modern algorithms decide which voices get amplified and which vanish into obscurity. The difference: our gatekeepers aren't scribes with quills, but opaque systems prioritizing engagement over truth. The lesson: preservation without curation is just hoarding. Then there's the question of who controls the narrative. Medieval rulers quickly realized that controlling scriptoria meant controlling history itself, hence the sanitized chronicles portraying kings as divinely favored heroes. Sound familiar? Modern platforms face the same ethical quagmire when governments pressure them to alter search results or suppress dissent. The scribes who resisted, like those smuggling subversive texts in book covers, have their counterparts in today's whistleblowers and encryption activists. Their shared insight: knowledge monopolies breed tyranny, whether the medium is vellum or viral tweets. Perhaps the most urgent parallel lies in the fragility of our systems. Byzantium scholars assumed their empire would last forever until the sacks of 1204 and 1453 proved otherwise. Their frantic efforts to smuggle texts to Italy mirror our own race to back up digital archives against cyberattacks and climate disasters. A parchment manuscript could survive centuries of neglect. A corrupted hard drive erases millennia in milliseconds. The scribes who duplicated texts across scattered monasteries understood what we're relearning. Redundancy isn't waste, it's the price of survival. Yet there's hope in the contrasts too. Medieval knowledge networks were slow, elitist, and shackled by dogma flaws our digital tools could remedy if wielded wisely. Imagine if the scribes of Cordoba had possessed Wikipedia's collaborative power, or if Hildegard of Bingen could have live-streamed her scientific insights to millions. The irony: we've built the infrastructure they could only dream of, yet often lack their clarity of purpose. Those monks copying Aristotle by candlelight didn't question whether preserving rational inquiry mattered. Do we share that conviction, or have we outsourced it to algorithms? The scribes' greatest legacy isn't the texts they saved, it's the ethos they embodied. That knowledge isn't just a commodity, but a sacred trust. Every time a medieval translator risked heresy charges to share a medical breakthrough, or a Jewish scholar preserved Greek logic through persecution, they affirmed a radical idea: that wisdom belongs to humanity, not to empires or algorithms. In an age where information is weaponized daily, that ideal feels more vital than ever. The quills are gone, but the choice remains. Will we be scribes or censors, gardeners of understanding or vandals of memory? The future of knowledge doesn't live in our tools, it lives in our hands. The hidden economies of knowledge remind us that ideas have always been the most enduring currency, more valuable than gold, more powerful than armies, because they outlived both. Medieval scribes understood this better than anyone. They weren't just copyists, they were the original network engineers, constructing bridges between cultures with nothing but ink and parchment. Think of the Jewish translators in Toledo, rendering Arabic medical texts into Latin under the watchful eyes of Christian patrons, or the Byzantine scholars smuggling Greek philosophy to Italy as their empire crumbled. These scribes worked in the shadows, knowing that the words they preserved could ignite revolutions centuries later. Today, we stand at a similar crossroads. Our digital age has democratized knowledge in ways those scribes could never have imagined, yet we're repeating some of their toughest challenges. Like medieval monasteries hoarding manuscripts, tech giants lock data behind paywalls and algorithms. Misinformation spreads like the rumor-filled broadsheets of the Renaissance, while fragile digital archives risk vanishing faster than parchment in a fire. But there's also hope in their legacy. The scribes who secretly copied forbidden texts, who traded ideas across enemy lines, prove that knowledge refuses to be contained. Wikipedia's volunteer editors, open access activists, even citizen scientists crowdsourcing research, they are all part of the same tradition, fighting to keep wisdom a shared inheritance, not a commodity. The cautionary tales are just as vivid. Scribes faced brutal consequences for trafficking in dangerous ideas, just as whistleblowers and journalists do today. The Church's index of prohibited books finds its echo in modern censorship, whether state-sponsored or algorithmically enforced. And let's not forget the scribes who compromised flattering patrons, erasing inconvenient truths, a reminder that knowledge is always shaped by power. The difference: our tools amplify both the risks and rewards. A single tweet can spark a movement, a deleted server can erase history. So what will future generations say about us? Will they marvel at our digital Alexandria or mourn the gaps left by our short-sightedness? The answer lies in choices we make right now. Every time we support public libraries, fact-check viral claims, or preserve marginalized stories, we're honoring the scribes' legacy. Their quills may be relics, but their mission to guard truth against time and tyranny has never been more urgent. The bridges they built lasted 1,000 years. What will ours carry into the next millennium? Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep the conversation alive. For more deep dives into history's untold stories, hit subscribe. And remember, you're not just a viewer, you're part of the change.